Hello, and welcome to Coffee with Convery. Today, we have a remarkable guest whose journey encapsulates resilience, faith, and the power of inclusion. Meet Andrew Fitisemanu, a dynamic individual who not only shines on the rugby field, but also advocates for diversity, equity, and inclusion in both sports and corporate environments. Andrew's story is one of evolution and empowerment. Growing up as a Catholic in New Zealand, Andrew found solace and strength in his faith. However, his path took a transformative turn when he moved to Australia, where he forged his own spiritual connection with God while embracing his identity as a gay man. On the rugby field, Andrew found not only a sport he excels in, but also a community that embraces him wholeheartedly. Coming out to his rugby community was a pivotal moment, one marked by acceptance and support. Through rugby, Andrew discovered the power of teamwork, inclusion, where differences are celebrated and strength is found in unity. Off the field, Andrew is also a beacon of change as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, leveraging his intensive corporate experience to champion mental health and LGBTQ plus rights. His involvement in initiatives like Rugby's Australia, part of a more series, underscores his commitment to foster a culture of belonging and acceptance. As Andrew continues to navigate his rugby career and inspires others with his story, he leaves us with a powerful message that resilience is found in embracing our authentic selves and standing tall in the face of adversity. Let's get going. And Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. That is an amazing introduction. That's 5 stars. That's definitely 5 stars. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, you have a very interesting and I think unique experience to share here today. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into it. But before we jump into your story, maybe we'll start with a few rapid fire questions, if that's okay.
Definitely. Let's go.
All right. So what are your pronouns?
My pronouns are he, him, his.
He, him, his. And what do you consider your superpower?
Do you know what's really interesting about the superpower? But one of the things I always think around how I approach problem solving, and I kind of in my mind, I map out problem solving in timelines. So I always think about that sliding doors moment where one action will trigger another reaction. How would they end up? And so I guess my superpower is that maybe I'm a bit of a crystal ball fortune teller, um, but also a bit of a chatterbox in there as well. I love a good conversation because that helps me solve problems too.
That's awesome. Good skills to have. Favorite smell?
Lime,
Lime. Love it.
lime. It
Uh,
is, yeah, can't get
and
enough of it.
and what is the best compliment you've ever received?
Best compliment, I think at this time that resonated with me, and it's probably a career path journey, is when I was in design school and I had a lecturer that I really respected, and he assessed one of my pieces of work, and he said, "You are talented," um, and that's something that resonates with me because at that point in time, I wasn't too sure if design was a field I wanted to pursue. And it was just the right time, the right place. And so every so often, and we're talking 30 years ago, possibly
Sure,
now,
sure.
but it's a compliment that resonates with me that when I think about doubt, I'm going, no, this is a reinforcement from somebody that I respected.
Yeah, and it still
So
sits with you today, which is super important. Um,
definitely.
if you had to pick a go-to snack, what's your guilty pleasure or snack?
I make this at home, cheesy popcorn.
Ah, okay.
Yep. Yep.
And you make it at home. So what kind of
I make
cheese?
Wow, I have this combination. So I've spent years. I love popcorn. I used to, my high school job used to be working in a movie theater cinema
Okay.
complex. So popcorn. So I've worked out this ratio of popcorn with um, vegan butter, nutritional yeast, paprika, garlic powder,
Nice.
um, and just a bit of chili powder. And the ratios have to be just right. And vegan cheese is something I've had to explore because I've finally accepted that I am allergic to milk protein. So I've
Yeah.
actually had to start being creative to recreate where my normal go-to snack was actually Parmesan cheese. Loved it.
Okay. Okay.
So
That's awesome.
actually,
That's quite a recipe. It's a
yeah, it's taken quite a few years to perfect, but I
yeah,
think I'm nearly there.
I bet. I bet. Did you have a favorite subject in school?
Yeah, it was actually art history.
Art history.
In high
Nice.
school, art history was a story that I really loved because it actually gave me more insight of how to read paintings and the hidden messages within them. Not just about painting techniques, but I guess going to high school and when you're from a religious background, you actually get to approach art to look at how the subtle religious meanings are within paintings or the reflective of how revolutionary terms was created through art. Um,
Nice.
and so I love that. I actually did. I just love listening to the stories of my high school art teacher, and he was amazing. His name is Rob Taylor. He's left us, but he resonated with me so well that when I look at paintings or artwork, it's really about for me to find what is the story here.
It's
And so, yeah,
it's interesting too. The link to your favorite subject is linked to an individual that, obviously influenced you too. So it's interesting how those two things collide. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right.
Didn't think about that.
I was gonna ask you what your first job is, but you just said popcorn maker. But was that your was that your first job?
It's hard to describe. I always think about first job as what first job did I have that actually I got paid for?
Okay.
So my first job was in the school holiday breaks and obviously coming from like a working class family, everybody gets a job in summer.
Yep.
And my first job was working in a large warehouse sorting mail over the Christmas period. And that was an eye opener because you realize what people are prepared to send in the mail to the
Oh,
other side of the world.
that's
Yeah,
interesting.
it's just really interesting, the size of the parcels. And you just think, goodness, they've missed this cut-off date. It's not going to arrive. Or
How
uh,
funny.
holiday cards, how people create little embellishments to customize it. I always thought that was just really interesting that you got a bit of a glimpse of people how they would send parcels in the mail and you can tell they're being parcels sent to loved ones or people who are in New Zealand and holidaying and sharing these kind of personalized postcards and I think postcards are really interesting because you don't see them that often anymore.
No, you don't.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a renaissance for postcards to come back. I feel that. But yeah, that was my first real paid job, and then working in a cinema, being a
Yeah.
cinema usher was a cool job.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Got to see some pretty cool movies, I guess, for free, right?
you did,
Yeah,
you get
there
to
you
see
go.
some good movies. And yeah, it was, and you're working with people your own age as well, which is quite
That's
cool.
that's really cool. If you
Yeah.
had to pick one word to describe yourself, what would you pick?
Oh, there's a word that resonates with me at the moment. Agitator.
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 I like it. I like
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Awesome. All right,
it's
let's
yeah.
jump in. I know at the beginning of the podcast you were talking about some different stories, and now I want to hear the listeners to hear some of this. So, can you go back and maybe paint a picture of your childhood for us? What are some of your fond memories you have from growing up in New Zealand?
Sure. So I was born in New Zealand. My parents were originally from Samoa, Pacific Island. So they immigrated to New Zealand, met in New Zealand, married, and flourished. My four other siblings, and I'm a middle child, so if that helps paint the picture of where I sit in my family.
Okay.
Um, and we're a working class family, very strong connections to church through our mother.
Yeah.
Um, and throughout our entire lives, we'd always gone to Catholic schools. That's the only thing I've really known from the school system, going to Catholic schools, but also knowing that there's a kind of a juxtaposition between raised in a Samoan family environment and having Samoan customs, but also knowing that when we go to a westernized school environment. The two elements are quite conflicting, but at that time, I also was going to with kids, school with kids from other migrant backgrounds as well. So it was kind of this. We call this melting pot, from this mixture of different cultures coming together. But one of the things I remember is that each of us would have our own kind of, I guess, ethnic identity being represented in a school system, but also knowing that there's a conflict because we're also living in a westernized environment. So growing up in the 80s, you'll kind of read these stories of what childhood was like in early New Zealand, but that doesn't resonate with me because my family only arrived in the country a decade before I was born. So that's where some of the things around childhood for me was always a position of I have two hats, raised in this colonial Western environment, but also knowing that I go home to Pacific Island environment.
Right.
And then knowing that I also have another community of Pacific Islanders that I'm associated and connected with. And so my family life has been growing up in New Zealand, which is also a relatively young country compared to other countries around the world. So we have this kind of multicultural, faceted uh, environment that is constantly challenging because not only do you think about colonization, but you also think about migration. Migration is a very big feeling
Yeah.
back in the 80s because during that time, Pacific Islanders were actually became the scapegoat for some of the economic issues of what New Zealand was going through. And for your listeners, it was a dark period in New Zealand history, and we call them the Dawn Raid periods.
Okay.
And basically, essentially, it was Pacific Islanders were described as overstayers at that point in time, the late 70s, early 80s period around then. And so the police would do early morning raids to find overstayed Pacific Islanders. Um, and that was through the political climate. And it's quite ironic, is that not what we're experiencing again? That there is another group of migrant communities. And looking back at that period, there is also that stigma being raised in a community, knowing that, hey, this actually just happened. And this
Mhm.
is it's a living trauma that a community has gone through, and that you now have a generation of children from either side of the spectrum of retelling this narrative. And I guess this is where in your youth, in my youth, you start to experience what is racism, what is prejudice, what is hate,
Mhm.
what is ignorance, essentially, and the difference between conscious and unconscious ignorance in there as well. And
Wow.
it's a really dark history for New Zealand, and also history of New Zealand's own Indigenous people, the Māori people of New Zealand. Um, a group of people are fighting to get their rights honored through a treaty. So I guess that is the childhood I grew up in, of this kind of political environment um, through conservative governments, and but also knowing that really cool people around me are trying to do really great things. And I guess every morning, my dad was an old school newspaper person, and he would just read the paper from literally from front to back. He read every single portion of it. And I would just love sitting and listening to my dad just talk about um, just the events. And then as we got older, I would listen to him talk about his migration story of how he arrived to New Zealand as a young man in his late teens, and how he had to find himself. And I guess where that's also shaped me in my journey of growing up. And I guess I'm also a 90s kid as well. So I went to high school in the 90s, literally started high school at 1990, ironically. So I guess that's kind of a nice anchor point for me. And I guess that's where I describe a nice journey of discovery for myself, which is going to an all boy Catholic school. which is threatening, but also exciting, but more threatening. And I've described that it's threatening because it's so foreign from anything I've ever seen. I went from a school of 50 students to 600 students.
Wow.
Um, so for me, that's more than like double fold of what I was expecting. But um, also being a younger brother of my brother who'd gone to the school before me. So there's this introduction. I'm starting to feel of what legacy feels like.
There you go. Yeah.
Um, and
Wow.
so and so I guess where the sports element comes in, my dad always, actually both my parents love sports. Um, Ironically, my mum is probably about like 5'10", a very short woman. Probably she's not 5'10", she's probably a little bit taller. But she always had determination. And if your listeners are familiar with the game of netball, um, which is a version of basketball, so my mother, being a very short person, knew her challenges, but still continued to play. And so I think, and my dad had always loved rugby, so we always were encouraged to play sports. And if we didn't like it, we were still going to be playing sports at some point.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So,
Wow.
and so 90s, that's basically what upbringing my childhood was influenced by. But also a heavily Catholic environment. And I think we talked about the story of school uniforms.
Yes.
Um, and so I always find essentially uniforms are comforting as well, but not from a conformist point of view. It is, I guess it's an environment that I love a good uniform, but you also got the opportunity to customize a uniform. And I think those of us who've gone to schools know that you have a dress code of what you must follow, but you can tweak those rules just to get your personality. Um, and so I just remember just doing weird things with your uniform, or I just remember if your listeners recall MC Hammer,
Yep.
you
Yep.
know,
Yep.
and do you remember its famous kind of airplane pants?
Yeah.
You know? And I just remember this as a high school memory of getting baggy pants, and I remember my friends and I at school we would cuff the ankles, so make the ankles a little bit shorter, so you kind of had these puffy style pants with narrow ankles.
Yeah.
You know,
That's a
and
visual. That's a visual. I can
that's a
see it.
visual.
Yeah, I
It's
can see it
a
right now.
it's a
That's
really
awesome.
terrible visual when I look back at it, but it was like that was
Hey,
the
that was
thing.
the fashion though, right? Like that was what people were wearing. And wow, what a robust, interesting upbringing you've had because when you weave in all those different things and you think about individuals and people as individuals, it's all of those things that make us who we are. But you've had exposure and experience in so many different dimensions. And I think when I think about some of our listeners too, are newcomers to countries, whether it be Canada, US, New Zealand, wherever, sometimes it's really difficult because you're trying to figure out how do you fit in. And sometimes, sometimes it's, and then you go home to what you know. And so I can only imagine that that's got to be a difficult time to try to figure out like, because the whole acceptance thing and let's be honest, sometimes kids aren't all that friendly or sometimes they pick on you, whatever it might be. Um, but thinking about that too, I know we talked a little bit at the beginning, and I know that you've gone through your own journey of coming out, and I just was curious as we talk about the LGBTQ plus listeners and some of our allies too, like when did you realize that you were gay and how did you navigate that realization given that whole situation you were in, which was already complex?
That's a question I continue to revisit and journey through.
Fair.
So I and that's it's quite interesting when I think about as a young person growing up. So I do remember in it's censorship laws are quite different around the world,
That's
and
right.
it and so when you think about what images you can actually see about what representation means, for example, what does romantic relationship and in the 80s it's always portrayed as between a man and a woman. and that anything outside of that was considered deviant.
Yep.
And so, how do you reconcile the identity of, oh, I actually don't think I feel the same way as the visual representation? So there is that doubt and shame. And that actually didn't come through a Catholic school environment. That was media. That was the media that portrayed and taught me that I was wrong to have these thoughts. And I call them thoughts at this point in time because
Yep.
when you're a young person, you don't know if they're feelings. You just have these images. You just go, oh, that's not what I pictured, or I don't think that resonates with me. And so the process of coming to where I am today as a gay male was going through a journey of thinking about am I bisexual, or
Hmm.
am I transgendered, or am I just not who I think I am? And so the process of how do you shed each of those layers is a journey that you go through. I I always think that, and there are parts of me that actually feel ashamed about this, that I tried to conform and I tried to have girlfriends. I
Hmm.
tried to blend in with everybody else. Um, and one of the things that I struggled with is there was nobody else out there that looked like me as a gay male. What I saw were, and this is not a criticism, but what I saw were effeminate men who didn't
Hmm.
play sport and who were Caucasian. And I thought that's the most opposite of me that you can get to. And so for me, it's really hard to actually work out, well, where do I fit and who do I resonate with? Um, and so to answer that question, I always think back, how did I make a different turn in this life? Um, and there are portions that I spent a lot of my life alone,
Hmm.
thinking, well, if I'm not meant to be in a gay same-sex relationship, then the best alternative is for me to be alone.
Yep.
And so I talk about this reflectively, looking back, how have things been? For example, my father passed away about 22 years ago now. And I realized I now have the sense of loss because we've never been able to have this conversation. Um, but then I also look at it, maybe it's also a gift that we have never had to have this conversation, and people
Yeah.
go, oh, wouldn't it be good to let them know your truth? And I would think, yes, but what would be the harm that could be created from that? What would be the
Yeah.
harm of growing up in that period? And let's remember that the AIDS crisis was not that long ago,
That's
from
right.
the 90s, and it was still prevalent in the early 90s, and it was still a death sentence. And so let's not think about how the fear for parents to have for their children,
Absolutely.
and when they think about, oh, they're going to choose a lifestyle. But even that language that we also have to address is talking about, you don't choose a lifestyle, you
Right.
don't choose to be gay or asexual. Um, you are who you are, but some of
Right.
us take time to discover that journey. So to describe that, it
Yep.
was a really challenging time because media told me one thing, but also sports told me that I couldn't be a sports person. Even though I would be insulted on the field as being told, "Oh, you're a fag,"
Right.
get such derogatory names. But I also took those names and went, "Oh, really? Let's play." Uh,
Yeah.
you know,
I
let's
guess
play.
so. Yeah. 100%. And that's why I want to ask you a little bit about the rugby community, because if I think of any sport that could be more masculine and, big guys on the field, like running at each other. And I know you had, well, I want you to share it. I know you said you had a pretty good acceptance and embracement by that community. And how did that help you shape your sense of identity and purpose? I'm assuming it would boost you up a bit, right? Where you might have been.
Um, it's funny because I was talking to you about before this, Brian, that as a Pacific Islander, we don't have this westernized approach of coming out stories,
Right.
you know. And I think when I talk about this coming out story, yeah, I've told people that I'm gay, or I told people at different points in my life, thinking, actually, I'm questioning. I don't know if I'm gay or if I'm bisexual, and because that was just the conversations. Um, and so I think that it's been, I guess it's like when you read a book and you start to flick through pages and you start to realize a part of the story continues to reveal itself. So there isn't this monumentous coming out story.
Right.
But when I think about the sports side of it, which was um so this is quite the irony. When I say irony of the story, I had actually stopped playing rugby. I decided, you know what? I'm in my 30s now. My body's battered. I think I've played enough rugby over the years, and so sometimes I would just join my friends back in New Zealand, and we might just have a casual game. It's great, you know, a social game, still just as hard, but you know, it was just one of the things. New Zealand has a really strong rugby culture, like literally
Oh
every
yeah.
single school has a rugby team, um, and so I moved to Melbourne, and it was just one of these points where I thought, you know what, playing sports is a great way to meet people when you're in a new town. My one of my brothers was living here at the time, and he suggested I go play for his old rugby club. I went, great, well, why not? And um, I had saw an advertisement for a gay rugby team in Melbourne, and I
Huh.
thought, oh, I've never really come across a gay rugby team. And I thought, okay, well, and obviously for me, I'm a person who knew that I was out of condition. I needed to train. So I thought I'll just double up. And so I just went to the gay rugby team, the Melbourne Chargers, went and trained with them. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting vibe because what connected this team was an identity
Yeah.
of gay men.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was kind of a new kind of environment where I was like, I've never, because that is the most furthest thing that I've ever thought about rugby being. You're connected either through family connections, you're connected through school environments, you're connected through work,
True. True.
you know. So rugby for me was always shaped in. I had a work colleague, great. He asked me to join his rugby team. Fine, I went along and played. Or my high school, we always played for the old boys rugby team when you graduated from high school and you just continue to play. You know, so we always had these connections, but a gay rugby team for me was I need to know what the heck this is. I need to know. Um, and so it's not like in New Zealand, I've known any other gay rugby player. Um, so I just went, great, join this gay rugby team. And it was interesting because I even had conversations with family and friends about when I joined this team and somewhat apprehensive for me, saying, do you really want to do this? That do, people will know. And I think it wasn't just that rugby community, that was family and friends who
Yeah.
were just concerned for me that this was a big step. And I said, no, it's fine. So I ended up playing. And how this had revealed itself is that word had got around that I had moved to Melbourne and I was playing for a gay rugby team, and the team was doing quite well. And what I was embraced by was friends at home sending me messages going, how are you? Um, are you enjoying yourself?
Good.
Um, is it competitive enough? Because obviously you have these questions that people want to know. Can queer sports be competitive?
That's an interesting
Can
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the stigmas that, and I also think it's, you know, this is where the media comes in, that we portray queer men in sports, and I only talk about just queer men in sports at the moment, as it's portrayed as, oh, you're so effeminate men can't play physical sports, or if you're a gay, you must be effeminate. And I thought, well, hang on, those are propositions that people are laying on an individual. And I
That's
thought
right.
it's once again we have to challenge those by actually either going, great, I either reject or I confirm their perceptions or views. But what I found is that the acceptance part for me was people actually checking in, people sharing stories
Yeah,
about remembering how when they played with me or when they played against me.
that's awesome.
Um, and so for me, that's where the acceptance piece came in. Um, and it was more than I expected because um, I had, and this is the other thing that I talk about, which is I had to also make peace with my own identity in this space, knowing that before I joined a gay rugby team, that I had to make peace that there are people in the world that will not want to be my friend.
Yeah,
Uh, there will be people in the world that will say things that will be triggering. For example, the phrase of, oh, I'm not sure why people would choose this lifestyle. And I would think the argument has always been, why do people choose our lifestyles that would persecute them? It's not a choice.
no, no, not at all. Can I ask you a question on like
Sure.
thinking about this? And I know lately, or I don't know if I should say lately, I've seen more athletes coming out in the media and more people sharing their background of being part of the LGBTQ plus community, which I think is good, and it's also inspiring for those who are up and coming, right? So if there's a listener here who's LGBTQ plus and plays rugby or football or whatever sport, and they're feeling like they're hiding or they're shamed about it, like what advice would you give to that young person to say about how to deal with it? Because you came out in a rugby team that was already obviously a gay rugby team, but you also played sports well before then. So
Hmm.
what advice would you give to a young person maybe listening to this who's struggling with their own identity and how to, and especially in sports?
Oh,
Is
I
that a
was
tough
asked
one?
this question. Well, it is a tough one. I have two things about this theme of role models in sport that we talk about because that's essentially what we're looking at, isn't it?
That's
It's
right.
who role model, who do you look to? And as myself growing up in New Zealand, there were no out queer athletes that I resonated with. Um, and so for me, obviously, what resonated with me was a Pacific Island background, that there were Pacific Islander athletes that resonated with me. And so they became my anchor points
Gotcha.
of cementing who I am. But we now are in a state of, and I do love that we have so many prominent athletes coming out across a range of sports, but I also think we have to be cautious about the number of athletes at that level coming out. And the reason why I say that is that it's great for a high level athlete to come out, but they also are in a position of privilege. They are also in a position that they can be protected by agents, by management structures, that there is a group of people that will help them navigate that space through
Mm,
that. And so I
very
think
true.
that's, we have to look at that, whenever there's a queer athlete that comes out, I'm going, yeah, great. But we also equally have queer athletes that participate at grassroots levels.
That's right. That's right. And they
We
may not
don't
have that community around them or that business model around them to allow, right?
They won't, but they have a community that have joined a team. And that is
That's right.
where, when, as a young person, I think looking back, if there were, and there was actually in New Zealand one gay rugby team that I heard of, and that was like very early in the 90s. And I actually met Dean Knight, who was the founder of the one of the first New Zealand queer rugby teams. Um, and it was one of the things he'd asked me a question of why, and he's a very good rugby player as well. But he had asked me the question as we were talking, why did I not join the queer rugby team? And I just said I didn't connect
That's
with the people. And I think that's one of the things about, if
that's
the
interesting.
young person is looking for a role model, look for someone that you connect with, because
Yeah.
when you're looking for that journey of overcoming adversary in society, it may not be the same level, that may not be the story that resonates with you, but there will be a connection. And when I say that, for example, I didn't see any queer out gay rugby players at a high elite level, but I saw Island or Pacific rugby players that I resonated with and I connected with them. And
Gotcha.
so that's the story. But I think we are now at a stage of we have so many, and when I say so many queer athletes, and I think there is an argument in the diversity inclusion space, which is we need to have more. And I think would more fix the conversation, would more help the conversation. And I think that's where the caliber of uh, quantity versus quality of those conversations. Um,
Very
and
true.
that's where the role modeling is one of the things around. But I think this is me. This is me versus I'm now 47. So me as a 47-year-old man versus me as a 17-year-old young person, my journey has changed, and it's been reflective of what points in my life could have changed if I saw an out rugby player. Would they have changed my
Mm.
journey? Because the connection piece may have not been there. Um,
That's
and
interesting. You're focusing on that connection. I get it, though. That's people need to have that connection to have a mentor or a coach or someone they can trust, right? And talk to.
I
Like,
think the trust element there that you just said, which is how you resonate with someone if you don't trust them. And this is the other thing, which is I always find, and people mean well, but they would say, "Oh, so and so is an out athlete," and I would think, "Thank you for letting me know," but it doesn't actually help. Um,
yeah, are you trying to
and
set
that's
us up or what? Are you
and,
serious?
and that's it. It was just like, oh, what do you think of them? And I think, well, it's a different sport, so I really don't know that sport well enough. Oh, but you're a sports person, and I would think, yeah, I know that they mean well, but I also think it's that connection. What
Yeah.
resonates with me, and that's where I think about my story. I don't feel that it should resonate with everybody because that's not my expectation. What I hope is that there will be elements that would resonate with people around that connection piece.
Oh, 100%. I think the insights you've shared here is tremendous because I think that whole idea of that connection is such a big part of sharing who we are, no matter who we are. I want to ask you a little bit about sports and business because I do talk to a lot of young people. I talk to students who some of them have maybe not had an internship or whatever, but that's because they were on the field or they were on the ice rink or they were wherever. And I think we don't enable or empower young people to talk enough about what sports did to them as far as skill building, right? Like teamwork, dedication, and all those things. What's been your experience with sports and how it's bridged you into the business world and things? Because I want younger people to start talking about it more, but they sometimes just think, oh, well, it's just a sport. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Definitely not. Definitely not. There are so many different transferable elements of sport. And it's interesting that I recall having this conversation with my brother years ago. And so we're all familiar with the scenario of what is it, Survivor, those reality TV shows.
Yeah.
And you always look at some of the participants and you can tell which one comes from a sports background and which one comes from a team sports versus individual based sports.
The tennis player versus the rugby player, right?
Exactly. Then, but what you can actually see is my brother and I were talking about is their tactics. An
Uh,
individual based player will actually focus on how they will manipulate components because they're a lone player. Or a team based player will actually come into that looking at, well, how do I build a team around me? And so that's some of the elements I would ask people to think about sports. Sports actually tells you about
yep.
tactics. Sports isn't only just about what I think people always focus on. Sports is about leadership, but sports also teaches you about how to follow.
Yeah.
Because sometimes environments in this corporate space, it's not always been about a strong leader. It's also about being a team player that commits to a portion of a project. And so for me, that is where the sports of me blends into the workplace, where I may be the lead for a certain part of a project, but I know tactically this is what my skill set is. For example, in rugby, I am a good scrummager and a good line-out lifter, but I'm not a wing. I'm not running. Like, there's no way I can break 100 meters under. Look, and I wish I could break it under 14 seconds. That's just not me. I'm not that person that you're going to give the ball to run and score a try. It could happen, but I'm not that person. And so
You're the one
I
I don't want to run into.
that would be me. I would be the person. You would be trying to avoid me, and that would be my goal, rallying you into a different portion of the field. I think sports has a really good place for people to think about teamwork, where even over the years I've played in so many different teams in a variety of different sports,
Yeah,
where how do you manage conflict, personality conflict as well?
big.
There are So ironic, I even remember in high school, I had a teammate. We did not like each other throughout the entire school period, could not stand each other, just were not friends. But we played on every single team together. We had the same classes. And it's funny, we're actually really good friends now, but we also just had to acknowledge did not like each other at high school and did whatever we could to avoid each other. But I also, what sports does? It teaches you about environments, but how can you actually work in an environment that people can be polite and courteous to each other. It also is around that portion of acceptance of another person because their identity is their own. You may not like it, but if they're polite and respectful to you and you're able to do the job together, that is what you do. I think with sports, there are so many different interpersonal skills that you can learn
For sure.
uh, in that environment. And I also think sports also teaches you around how to read a toxic environment and realize that this is not for me and I have the power to leave. And that is the
Yep.
same thing in corporate environments. If
Yeah,
a corporate, and that's where I talk about the well-being portion of this story is if an organization and the environment is not for you, it's toxic, you have the power to leave. Now, I know it's a brave choice for me to say that to young people at this point in time. Um, but I would also ask people, hey, sports also teaches you an exit strategy. You
I,
take that into environments as well.
I love that. I love that because I know mental health was one of the things I did want to ask you about, and I see some people are really suffering right now. And feeling things that they're just not comfortable feeling, and no one should have that power over you. If you don't, if you're going to work and you're feeling beat up every day, then don't stick around. There's other jobs, there's other places to work, right?
And I do feel that it's a conversation that we do need to have openly out there as well, because obviously there is a sphere of job scarcity. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are other jobs out there, but this is where we live in a time where it's a post-COVID benefit now that people around the world have actually started to connect it, like you and I. On literally, we talk about different time zones of the
Yeah,
day,
yeah,
different parts of the world, even probably potentially different seasons. But we're able to have a connection and talk about what is going on, what is relevant. You talked about immigration in Canada at the moment. And I resonate that with my background as from a migrant
yeah,
background and also experiencing what migration looks like as a migrant who's moved to Australia. Because culture clash, yes, Australia and New Zealand may on paper seem very similar countries, but I've actually moved to a country that has a very different vernacular, has a different history, different, slang here is for me is like I don't even understand what people are saying. Um, and so I think that when we talk about environmental change and in that corporate environment, bringing back to well-being is really important. And I also ask people to think about the career path you choose, that it could be stressful, but there are also elements that you can bring in that sense of mental health, physical health, psychological safety. When I talk about well-being as well for people in those environments that may feel uh, threatening, it's
Hmm.
also to get what is it about the role that makes it threatening? Is it the individuals or is it the work? And I think those are some of the things that really to unpack with people to think about when does the work environment impact on your own well-being?
Yep.
And and some roles are great at creating the balance for you. Like I know that in a previous role, I actually had to have an honest conversation with my manager that I need to exercise in the middle of the day. I need to get out.
Yeah.
And I know I remember from her point of view, it was like, odd. Why would you want to do that? And I said, because I just need to get this anxious feeling that I have out, and physical exercise is that positive way for me. And so I remember she had that conversation with her lineup manager to actually talk about just don't be surprised if you see Andrew going for a run outside. And I remind some of your listeners, I may not look like a runner, but I actually did enjoy running. So then I moved into my different phase. But I think that's one of the things you need to find in a corporate environment who's going to advocate for you. And if the advocate for you is not going to be there,
It's key.
then yeah, and then find an advocate maybe outside of your organization, like mentoring programs. But I think it's really key that people find that connection with don't sacrifice your well-being, but
Yep.
you also have to think about well-being for me is also an element of exploration.
Yeah.
Explore what well-being means because community well-being is one of the themes that I love in this pillar of well-being because it's that connection to communities. Once again, connection is really key with me as well.
100%. Wow, this has been such an amazing conversation, and it's so chock full of insights and ideas. And I know our listeners are loving this conversation, this episode, because the more and more you talk about it, the more and more you make those connections to what really is on top of people's minds today. And I could talk to you for another hour, and I know we got to start to look at wrapping, but was there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to cover, maybe to leave with the listeners, or is there anything that top of mind?
I guess top of mind for me is, um, you know, the identity that you have today does not need to be the identity that you have tomorrow. You have the ability to change. And I think that's one of the things that, as myself going through different voices of who I talk to about what their perceptions of me are, it's like, hey,
Yep,
but I'm allowed to change because human is growth.
yep,
And so I just will
absolutely.
remind your listeners to think about who you are today. You're allowed to change over time, and you also can come back and revisit those things. We talked about trade industries. Who knew? Maybe I was not meant to be destined in a corporate environment. Maybe I should have actually chosen a trade industry. And so let's just revisit some of these influences of what made our choices. Because when I say revisit them, it's like, hey, you can also choose to go back and revisit some of those career
That's
paths
right.
where it didn't, for me, is actually a passion that I'm starting to explore again.
Yeah, I think thank you, because I think that's super, super key in this conversation too, is life is a journey and it's exploration. And no matter what age you are, what part of your career, like you could have career portfolios, you could experience different things. And I don't think you need to be tied to one thing or one title or one type of job. And um, like people ask me like, "Oh, how did you get to your part of your career?" I'm like, I'm still exploring. I don't know what I'm gonna be doing next, right? Same with you. Like this is what life's about. But Andrew, I can't thank you enough. This has been such an engaging and fun conversation. And can I call you mate now? Is that proper, mate? Or is that not a New Zealand thing?
No, you can. It is
Is
a New
that,
Zealand thing.
I don't
I
know if
just
that's,
think,
what is that word all about? So,
okay. I just think that, yeah, there's a history into the word mate. It
oh,
has roots into it. That look, I would essentially just say we would embrace the modern day terminology of mate, which is connection and friendship.
that's right. Okay, that sounds good because I feel really blessed that I got to meet you and talk with you today. And Got a little bit of you in this podcast to share with the listeners. So thank you so much for being a part of it.
You're welcome, Brian. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So for the listeners, if you like what you heard today, please share this podcast with your network on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can follow us on Instagram and see all the exciting stories there. This has been Coffee with Convery. Until next time, please stay well.